Hello guys, it's me Simo Orahara, and in this video we're gonna talk about a special character. But before that, let me ask you these questions. Who is the real counter for Yhwach? Who is the person who knew how much Yhwach is dangerous? Which person was planning to find a solution to defeat Yhwach? Perhaps after asking these questions, you would think about people such as Yamamoto, because probably was the one who defeated Yhwach 1000 years ago, or maybe Ichigo, who forced Yhwach to activate the Almighty. But the truth is that none of these characters knew Yhwach to defeat him. Indeed, there is another character who was the main reason for the defeat of Yhwach, a very important figure in the story of the Quincy as a race. Unfortunately, it was strangely neglected by Kobo. I'm talking here about Ishida, the Sternreiter who stood against all the plans of Yhwach, the Sternreiter that was expelled from the castle of the Wanderreich. And for those who watch my videos regularly, 8 months ago I published this video, and it was the second part of the video of Yamamoto versus Yhwach. And I told you at the end of that video that there is a third part where I'm gonna talk about how the Ishida family were also planning to stop Yhwach. And through my theory of that video, I said that Yhwach has a plan of 1000 years ago, so that he was planning to restore the world after 1000 years of waiting. And I said that one of the reasons why Yhwach waited all that time, because he waited for the birth of Ichigo to cut off Ryo and thus become the actual ruler of the world. And so during that long period he was planning several things, including the conquest of the Quincy lands in the real world, and his mating with Yhwach and making him his right hand, and making new army called the Sternreiter, and his battle against Yamamoto, and then the building of the hidden castle, the Wanderreich, and re-equip a new generation of Sternreiter with more powerful powers. Of course, all these things were for Yhwach to reach his greatest goal of restoring the ancient world he wanted. However, at the same time, another person, who is Ishida, was planning to stop him from achieving that goal, because Ishida seems to have been aware of the seriousness of what Yhwach was planning, and that Yhwach is the greatest danger to the entire world. Therefore, he was looking for a solution to stop him through a long-term plan, a plan that I can name it the Ishida plan, a plan where 3 generations will involved in it: the grandfather Ishida, the son Ryukin Ishida, and the grandson Yuryu Ishida. And so I will try to explain how Ishida was trying to do this. So as a start, I can say again that Ishida depth in the story of the Quincy is so great that you can't imagine, especially his history in his relationship with the Wanderreich and Yhwach himself. And I'm sure that whoever ends watching this video will be surprised by the depth of the Quincy subject and the number of the topics we could have seen. So like I said, we have very little about Sokin in the manga. We have scenes of him with Yuryu at the beginning of the story, and after that we didn't see any other scenes in which he appears, except for some scenes in which some characters talked about him, such as the scene of Yhwach and the scene of Ryukin and the flashback of Ishin, as well as the scene of chapter 674. And from what was said about him, we can conclude that Sokin was a Sternreiter within the Wanderreich, because in chapter 674 Ryukin used his father's necklace that's called the Key of the Sun to move to the castle of the Wanderreich, and Yuryu said to Ichigo in one of the chapters that this necklace is given to the Sternreiter so that they can move to different places of the castle through gates called the Gates of the Sun. And Ishin was surprised how the necklace still works after all these decades, and here Ishin added a very important words about Ishida when he said he is grateful to Ryukin's father for how he used his wits to use this necklace so that he was able to escape after he was kicked out of the Wanderreich. And this is very important statement because it matches what Yhwach said in this chapter when he told Ichigo that the ancient holy release became a thing of the past and expired 200 years ago, and that the only person who kept using it was Ishida, who opposed their research. And through these words we can understand that Ishida was a figure in opposition to the policy of the Wanderreich And this is what I like the most about this character. Soken, it seems that when he was Sterrenrichter in the Wanderreich, he saw several things he didn't like. Perhaps the most prominent of their research, in which they wanted to remove the identity of the Quincy by developing their abilities in order to obtain powers that would make them mere monsters. And we saw this both with Kilgi Oppi and even some Sterrenrichter who obtained powers that made some of them mutants. And that's just a part of the story. For sure, Soken Ishida had a view beyond all of this, and it is that this research and what the Wanderreich is doing is for something bigger planned by Yhwach. And this is why the biggest question remains, at any period Soken Ishida was with the Wanderreich. Was Soken Ishida among the survivor of the first war against the Shinigami and stayed with Hashvald and the rest inside the hidden castle? Or is it later, after the first war against the Shinigami ended, Soken joined the Wanderreich? And I go with this possibility because I already said in a previous video about Quincy that the Quincy themselves divided on each other. There is a part that went with Yhwach and participated in the war against the Shinigami 1,000 years ago, and they were believers of Yhwach's ideas, and they were the ones who later founded the Wanderreich in Serity. And there is a part that was against Yhwach and his policy from the beginning, because we must not forget that Yhwach, before he attacked the Soul Society, he was waging a civil war where he was attacking the cities of the Quincy, and among the victims of that war were Busby and Hashvald, and based on those attacks, Busby wanted to revenge. Therefore, there is no doubt that some noble families were against Yhwach and what he wanted, so they fought him before Yhwach finally took control of the entire lands of the Quincy and the real world. Because we must not forget again that if the Shinigami have high-ranking families that called noble families such as Kuchiki, Shohin, etc., we can find the same thing on the Quincy side. There were families that we can say were the noble families of the Quincy, such as the Ishida family and Kurosaki family. So in my personal opinion, these two families were against Yhwach and against what he wanted to do. So it is possible that the Ishida family resisted Yhwach at the beginning, but later defeated and submitted to the rule of Yhwach in the end when he was invading the lands of the Quincy. So I'm sure that Soken Ishida followed the same policy as Busby and Hashvald, I mean joining the Wanderreich to kill Yhwach, or maybe to figure a way how to stop all of this. In the sense that as a first possibility, maybe he was present for his noble family war against Yhwach and his army when they wanted to invade the lands of the Quincy, and therefore he saw the killing of his family members, and on the basis of that he also wanted to join the Wanderreich and then staying with the survivor and started to think about how to kill Yhwach. Or there is the second possibility, which I tend to, is that Soken Ishida was born a few centuries after the first Quincy War, because we must not forget again that after the first war, the Quincy, as I said, was divided in two parts. One that escaped and hid in the shadows of the Serity, and the second one did not participate in the war and remained in the real world, and they are the noble families because they were against Yhwach in the first place. And among them is the Ishida family. So when Soken Ishida was born, he knew through his family members the story of Yhwach and the crimes he had committed against his own kind. So he wanted to know by himself why basically Yhwach wants to do these things. And as I said in this video about the Quincy, there is no doubt that after defeating the Quincy, Hashvald, who was the successor of the sealed Yhwach, he wanted to build a new army of Sterrenrichter, and this process extended for 1000 years, and perhaps it was over multi-periods of time, so that every time a special squad came out to recruit some youth Quincy in order to include them in the Wanderreich. That's why we saw this diversity among the Quincy members. On this basis, it's very likely that Soken Ishida received an official invitation to join the Wanderreich, and this request may be based on his distinction. If you notice, Ryukin is a doctor, as well as Yuryu became a doctor and succeeded his father. So this is why it's very likely that Soken Ishida Ishida was also a doctor or precisely a genius surgeon. And this is an important point that I will mention shortly. So the important thing, as I said, because of his distinction and the fact that he is a doctor, he was invited to join the Wanderreich in order perhaps to see the condition of Yhwach. Because as we know, Yhwach was sealed for 900 years, so undoubtedly he should have monitored the development of his situation. So it is possible that Soken Ishida was at one point in charge of the development of Yhwach's condition, or he was participant in some scientific research. What matters is that when Soken entered the Wanderreich, it seems that he initially wanted to change it from the inside, and so he tried to convince them that their policy will not lead to anything good, and that this approach will bring destruction to Quincy, and that the main danger is not the Shinigami but that sealed person Yhwach. And the Quincy fought a war with the Shinigami and lost it, so why would we waste all this time and effort only to revenge when Quincy can live in the real world and come to an agreement with the Shinigami? These are Soken's idea and his philosophy, and this is confirmed by his scenes with Yuryu at the beginning of the story. Through his words with his grandson, we can see that he was never a hater of the Shinigami. On the contrary, he didn't hold them all the responsibilities for what happened to Quincy 200 years ago. So back to the days of Soken's presence in the Wanderreich, it seems that after several attempts to convince the Wanderreich to abandon their ideas, Soken learned that the talk was no longer useful, especially after he began to feel that someone inside the Wanderreich was demanding his expulsion or perhaps killing him, and that's why he finally decided to escape and return to the real world, and there he returned to his family members and began to work individually on how to stop Yhwach. It is possible, according to Kilgi OP, that Soken was expelled from the Wanderreich 200 years ago, and he may have spent a few decades alone before he married and had Ryuken. And by the way, his wife, in one of the scenes when Ryuken asked her where his father was, she said that he headed to the 5th field and that she doesn't know when he will return. And this may give us a perception that Soken was really busy doing either some research or things related to how to stop Yhwach, because the basis of making the arrow that paralyzed Yhwach's abilities started with Soken, because Soken is the one who came up with that theory. Ryuken said that he had heard his father saying if the silver that forms in the hearts of the hybrid Quincy's was mixed with the blood of the one who released the Auswern, it would paralyze his abilities. And that's why I told you that Soken seems to have been a surgeon, because how would he come up with this theory if he hadn't done some operation on Quincy's body? And I don't know if Soken thought of this theory after Yhwach woke up and did the Auswern that led to the death of his daughter-in-law as well as Masaki, or did he already have an idea about the subject so that Yhwach may have already done this ritual 1,000 years ago. Therefore, after doing several types of research, he came to this conclusion, and later when Yhwach woke up on June 17 and did the Auswern, which resulted in the death of both Kachigiri and Masaki, Soken told his son the theory, and the latter set out to try to implement it by dissecting his dead wife. And it may be that both Soken and Ryuken knew about Yuryu's hidden powers as well as Yhwach, because Yuryu is basically not a pure Quincy. However, Auswern did not kill him, because the Auswern ritual that Yhwach performed on the 17th was aimed at killing all the hybrid Quincy, and this explains why Ryuken told his son that you are the only one who can shoot this arrow. And this arrow was mainly made of silver that formed on the hearts of the hybrid Quincy, as I said, who died as a result of the Auswern. And therefore, as long as Yuryu is a hybrid and did not die because of the Auswern, this could be due to the power that Yhwach talked about it, and that's why Yuryu was the only one who should shoot that arrow. And I find it similar to the idea of my theory in which I talked about the fact that Ichigo was also the only one who was able to cut Yhwach with his real sword, which is basically a copy of Yhwach's sword. And so you can see that the one who was seriously thinking of finding a solution to defeat Yhwach was not Yamamoto or Ichibi, but Soken Ishida. Soken, who was a Sternritter in the Van der Reich and knew the secrets of Yhwach, and based on that, he tried to repel his danger from the Quincy first and the world as a whole, because in the end Yhwach gave up all the Quincy they were with, and this supports Soken's view of Yhwach and how he never considered the Shinigami a threat. Also, the idea that Soken was killed by 5 hollows seems illogical to me, or let's say is not the full truth. Is it possible that a former generator would simply be defeated against 5 hollows? And we're talking about a pure-blooded Quincy. So I find it exactly the same as what happened to Masaki against the Grand Fisher. Masaki, even with the contaminated blood, as Ishin said, would have been able to kill that Grand Fisher easily. I'm not saying that Soken has been exposed to the Auswehren too, because apparently the Ishida family is immune to this ritual. In Yhwach's last use of that power, when he stole power from both Harsveld and Gerard, Yuryu and Ryuken were not harmed, even though they were on the same battlefield. What I personally think is that Yhwach met Soken, and maybe he offered him a certain deal, and Soken refused it, which led Yhwach to fight him, and by that fight, Soken became an easy target for hollows, which led to his death. It could be that or something else, because it's unreasonable that a character like Soken would die at the hands of 5 hollows in this way. It might be something we don't know was the main reason for Soken's death. In the end, guys, Kobo didn't deal well with Soken Ishida, because this character was the key of this arc. If we had flashback of him when he was a Chernator and how he was expelled, we would have learned a lot about the Quincy. So this is the end of my video, guys, and see you in my next video.